Chrono Cross was kind of like a beautiful wave, arriving at just the right time within the zeitgeist, at the height of Squaresoft's inspiration during what many refer to as the golden age of RPGs. For those of us who enjoyed it, especially those who played it at the right time, it had a magic all its own, which very few games have achieved before or since. With some standout exceptions, of course. A handful of games have things in common with Chrono Cross, such as its pre-rendered backgrounds, its vivid tropical setting, its deep reflections on the human experience, or its unutterably beautiful soundtrack and richly conceived world setting. But for me anyway, Chrono Cross really stands on its own. At least, very few games have influenced me in quite the same way. Chrono Cross is so much a part of me that I struggle to imagine how the events of my life might have unfolded without it. An appropriate sentiment for Square Enix, but especially this series. Chrono Cross, like its predecessor, is all about what might have been, and what still could be, and, well, it's also about so much more. It's about dreams and memories, self-reflection and self-transcendence. It's about unraveling the conflicts between good versus evil, nature versus nurture, and past versus future. It's about existential dread, coming of age, grief, death, and, well, life. Especially life. Chrono Cross, alike to another favorite game of mine, Majora's Mask, man that was a good Christmas, entices the player to peer into the nooks and crannies of other people's lives, exploring their dreams, hopes, relationships, and sorrows, often rewarding us for helping to unravel their innermost conflicts, bringing estranged loved ones back together, or just for lending a sympathetic ear. Of course, I'll be the first to admit that, when compared to some of these other games, and notably when compared to Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross lacks a bit of polish. For one thing, not everyone agrees, even in the purely literal sense, upon what actually happened in that game. Some of its characters' motivations, subplots, and backstories were a little vague, confusing, convoluted, or occasionally even contradictory. To such a degree that even after numerous playthroughs, it can still be difficult to keep it all straight. So, I'm going to try my best to briefly recap my own interpretation of the plot in chronological order, whatever that means in a story that has things like branching timelines, optional endings, Chronopolis, and the Fate Engine, while expounding upon its most important and influential characters, such as Turnip and Skelly. But let me just say that if you haven't already seen my Chrono Trigger analysis video, I do recommend watching or perhaps even re-watching that first. It sheds light upon several subjects, themes, and events pertaining to Chrono Cross, and is complementary to the ideas discussed within this video. Also, if you haven't played Chrono Trigger, or Chrono Cross of course, much of this may be confusing and there will be spoilers for both games. Lastly, I'm going to be leaving Radical Dreamers out of this analysis, mainly for the sake of pacing. Around the year 65 million BC, Lavos falls to the Earth. Presumably around the same time, an extremely potent artifact of Lavos, later dubbed the Frozen Flame, finds itself within a part of the ocean later dubbed the Sea of Eden. Around the year 3 million BC, the Frozen Flame is discovered by humans, remaining in contact with humanity for the majority of its evolution until it is eventually lost and fades into legend. Most of the events of Chrono Trigger ensue as a result of that artifact. At various points between 65 million BC and 2300 AD, Lavos is challenged by Chrono and his time-traveling allies, splitting the timeline. Chrono is triumphant in several different branches, but finds the greatest success during a branch dubbed Keystone, and thereby thwarts one apocalyptic future while achieving an optimal degree of peace. However, the initial crash landing of Lavos, the ensuing Ice Age, and all other major events before the moment of its defeat are still active within the Keystone timeline. As a result, shards of Lavos remain on Earth, and several individuals including Schala, Janus, Dalton, and the Gurus remain displaced in time. At some indeterminate point, thousands of years after being lost, the frozen flame is rediscovered, possibly by the guru Belthasar. Sometime after 2300 AD, Belthasar appeals to the contemporary government known as the Central Regime and assembles a team of elite scientists to establish the time fortress Chronopolis under the guise of research, in the hope of retrieving the lost princess Schala. Once established, Belthasar repurposes the Central Regime's supercomputer Mother Brain to construct the Fate Engine, adapting the frozen flame as its power source. Belthasar also equips Chronopolis with the Prometheus Circuit, a security system which makes sure that only one person, referred to as the Arbiter, is able to command the frozen flame at a time. The Fate Engine is then trained with millions of years worth of geographical, biological, and psychological data, and attains a godlike degree of insight and functionality. Using the trained Fate Engine to search for Schala, Belthasar soon discovers the existence of the Time Devourer, an aspect of Lavos lingering on the edges of reality, which has merged with the powerful, magical princess, and now poses a threat not just to the planet, but the entire universe. In order to circumvent this entity's emergence into reality, Belthasar's team commences the counter-time experiment, hoping to send Chronopolis back in time to 12,000 BC and prevent the moment of Schala's disappearance, without erasing much of Chrono's work. However, due to the heightening influence of Lavos via the frozen flame, the experiment goes wrong and Lavos becomes even further entangled with the timeline than before. In response, a corrective aspect of the planet's timeline, presumably the entity, kicks into gear, and rebalances the highly intrusive presence of Chronopolis by introducing Dinopolis, an equally influential magical metropolis from a timeline in which reptiles were the dominant species in lieu of humans, and evolved into the highly advanced Draconian race. With Dinopolis comes the Dragon God, an artificially created being capable of controlling nature and roughly as powerful as the Fate Engine, and likely also entangled with Lavos. A conflict ensues. Belthasar, more determined than ever, endeavors to find the perfect timeline in which Lavos can be stopped for good and Schala can be freed. All of his research points him towards a highly specific string of events revolving around a young boy named Serge, which would necessitate splitting the timeline during the year 1010. More on that later. Right around this time, the Fate computer starts to become sentient, and to ensure its own eventual construction in the 24th century, begins terraforming the Sea of Eden into the El Nido archipelago, encouraging the Chronopolis workers to populate its islands and slowly turning the entire region into an isolated artificial paradise. Fate engineers rough seas and weather patterns to keep the outside world from entering, while using advanced manipulation techniques to discourage its inhabitants from leaving, and protecting Chronopolis with advanced cloaking technologies. El Nido, thus, remains undisturbed for millennia. However, during El Nido's formation, the human settlers war with the Draconians, eventually causing Dinopolis to sink into the ocean, forcing the surviving Draconians to resettle throughout the islands in defeat, and to divide their dragon god into 6 slightly weaker components. The relationship between the humans and Draconians remains tense, but a small degree of friendship and even interbreeding prevails. Later, as the millennia roll by and technology advances, mainland humans from the Zenin continent finally manage to enter El Nido, though Chronopolis and the Frozen Flame remain hidden beyond vague rumors of a magical, wish-granting jewel. Sometime after that, El Nido is colonized by mainland humans, governed by the Viper clan and its elite retinue, the Acacia Dragoons. Further marginalized, the Draconians die out. However, their hybrid descendants, the magically gifted demi-humans, remain, only to be brutally ostracized by the colonists. Overall, the two cultures remain separated, and this relationship continues to deteriorate. Around the year 1005 AD, the Poor army, led by a time-displaced Dalton, attacks the Kingdom of Guardia on the mainland, establishing Poor as the dominant global power. Although Poor becomes interested in El Nido soon after, initially, the presence of the Acacia Dragoons keeps them in check. Now, in 1006 AD, in El Nido, a fisherman, Wazuki, sails for the Isle of Marbul in pursuit of a specialist to save his gravely ill toddler, Serge, but is blown off course into the Sea of Eden during a very sudden magnetic storm, which happens to temporarily disable the securities of the entire previously cloaked time fortress. While Chronopolis is offline, the Fate computer is blind, and its thus temporarily unimpeded rival, the Dragon God, manages to spawn an incarnation of itself into El Nido. More on that later. Meanwhile, still desperate to save his son, Wazuki takes Serge inside Chronopolis in the hope of encountering the Frozen Flame, and possibly using its wish-granting powers to heal Serge. Once in contact with the Frozen Flame, Serge is healed, but is also accidentally granted the highest level of clearance to the computer's core, thereby becoming irreversibly entangled with the Frozen Flame and, by extension, Lavos and Schala, and in the process usurping the Fate Engine's own direct access to the flame. As we'll see later, this was intended by Belthasar. However, having predicted this, right before this moment, Fate uses the flame to infect Wazuki's mind with a malignant influence, which gradually gains control. Thus, in 1010, Fate's corruption causes Wazuki to drown the 7-year-old Serge, and this is where the timeline splits in two.
Don't worry, there will not be a quiz.
So, in another world's version of reality, the young Serge dies, and control over the Frozen Flame reverts to the Fate Engine, who uses it to reshape Wazuki into its primary enforcer, Lynx. More on him later. However, in the homeworld version, a mysterious girl named Kid is sent back in time to rescue Serge from the brink of death. More on that later too. Without the Fate Engine's continued influence over El Nido, Homeworld's altered timeline spins wildly out of control, with devastating consequences, allowing the poor army to invade El Nido and, naturally, for Lavos to return, and likely erasing the homeworld version of Fate along with Belthasar's entire cloaked metropolis in the process, by preventing it from being created in the future. This results in a massive, localized time distortion, rendering Homeworld's Frozen Flame inaccessible. Homeworld's Sea of Eden becomes the Dead Sea as a result. Fate, meanwhile, continues to act directly through Lynx in another world, predicting that the still-living Serge will eventually cross over into another world, thus regaining the flame's clearance. Fate prepares for his arrival, gaining power and influence over the next several years by insinuating himself into the Viper clan and the Acacia Dragoons, and also teaming up with a strange, powerful mage named Harle. However, unbeknownst to the Fate Engine, Harle is the incarnation of its nemesis, the Dragon God. Lynx makes various attempts to capture and thwart Serge. Serge, meanwhile, allies with Kid, a mysterious, feisty young thief obsessed with stealing the Frozen Flame. Eventually, Lynx and Harle manage to trap them both, forcing Serge into an ancient Draconian ritual, which causes him to switch bodies with Lynx. Lynx, once in Serge's body, takes Kid away and heads for Chronopolis, sealing Serge, now in Lynx's body, into a temporal vortex. However, Harle immediately abandons Lynx and helps Serge to escape into his normal realm. She then travels with him for some time in place of Kid, hinting that he can get his body back if he obtains the Dragon Tear. Serge and Harle go on a series of quests together, until he gradually manages to defeat all 6 elemental dragon gods in battle, and obtains the Dragon Tear and thus his body. Then, Serge enters the Sea of Eden in another world, where, after learning a great deal of backstory, he takes the entire Chronopolis installation offline by destroying its defenses and defeating the Fate Engine. The elemental dragons, at last unchecked by Fate, recombine to form the Dragon God once more, stealing the Frozen Flame. Harle's consciousness re-merges with the Dragon God. Around this point, depending on the timeline, Serge may or may not attain the Chrono Cross. More on that later. Serge's party defeats the Dragon God, after which the remaining Frozen Flame vanishes. And finally, with both flames, the Dragon God and the Fate Engine neutralized, a precarious balance is achieved, and Belthasar instructs Serge to defeat the Devourer of Time. If Serge successfully uses the Chrono Cross to do this, Schala is saved, Lavos is presumably gone for good, and a lasting balance is presumably restored to the Earth, and possibly to the entire universe. But if Serge defeats the Time Devourer in any other way, we're left with an unsettling sense that history is fated to repeat itself.
Naturally, this is a lot to unpack, but I think to best understand the richly layered themes within Chrono, we should start by examining humanity's relationship with nature, which ultimately requires an examination of humanity's relationship with itself.
Humanity, brought to you by nature, the scented caress of petals in a spring shower, and the pitiless snarls of a tiger rending your flesh. The soothing sigh of waves kissing your knees on a balmy summer night, and the shuddering moans of frozen rocks cascading down the mountainside as they smash your settlement to pieces.
In Chrono, there are two extreme perspectives regarding nature, one which prefers to idealize it and another which prefers to demonize it.
On the one hand, I'd even say that Chrono, perhaps more than any other game, is a love letter to nature. In several of its overarching themes and story beats, in its lush organic soundtrack, contrasted with its hauntingly peaceful silence. And through its exquisite visuals, featuring sumptuous, agonizingly beautiful locations. Several of its characters also express nature's physical and psychological necessity within our lives, conveying themes pertaining to latent animal instinct, evolution, the wisdom of studying and allying with the natural world, the preciousness of ecosystems, or even the simple joys of natural beauty. On the other hand, the player is repeatedly shown the violence, caprice, and cruel indifference of the natural world, reminding us at every opportunity that life on Earth cannot escape the shadow of death. We're also reminded that humans are wont to reflect this same violent caprice right back towards other life forms, implying that humans essentially represent nature at its worst, even referring to us as the children of Lavos. Not only killing for survival, but reducing entire biomes to disposable commodities, and bending, sometimes brutalizing the natural world to conform to our preferences. We are warned in various ways of the hubris inherent of suppressing nature in any form, be it flora, fauna, or even our fellow man, that when time-honed systems are disrupted, they often respond destructively, kicking into overdrive to correct anomalous circumstances. But the Chrono series would also suggest that there is a way to live in harmony with the so-called elemental forces. And a canny guru of life might say that in order to achieve this harmony, and therefore to thrive within nature, or even just to survive nature, we ought to get to know nature, without fear, without greed, and without pride.
However, this is tougher than it might sound.
Nature is two things at once. It is curiously fragile, which is where greed comes into it. Sometimes resources can and do run out. Ecosystems, climates, and geology can and will change, and not necessarily in the ways we expect. An ancient reptilian greed is therefore present in every decision facing nature's inherent unpredictability. On some level, the greediest parts of us are desperate to hedge their bets, to acquire as many resources as possible, even to make resources scarce for others. The greediest among us, metaphorically speaking, would rather have 100 boulders in a sea of pebbles than 1 million boulders in a sea of boulders. Underlying this primordial greed is fear. Fear of extinction, of limitation, and of suffering. But here's where pride comes into it. Nature is also miraculously resilient. It was here long before us, and it will be here long after we're extinct. For some, this simple reality is, well, intolerable. We want to believe that we're important, that we're special somehow, and that we will beat the odds and master not only our own planet, but eventually other worlds beyond. For the especially ambitious among us, it's not enough simply to explore Earth and space, not enough to learn about it, to enjoy it. We must conquer it. We must possess it. We must carve it into our own likenesses. This, too, is rooted in fear, because maybe the only thing worse than extinction, death's further, perhaps ultimate implication, is irrelevance, obsolescence, meaninglessness. Now, humanity, being a part of nature, is also both fragile and resilient. Sometimes people fall out of airplanes and live. Sometimes humans die from bee stings or have heart attacks in their sleep. If you're fairly familiar with my other content, you may already know where I'm going with this. If we want to get to know the external world without fear, without greed or prejudice, and to truly experience ourselves as being part of the web of life, first we must familiarize ourselves with our own internal natures.
And this, I believe, is what Chrono Cross is all about.
Chrono Cross emphasizes that the carnal dualities of strength and weakness, of creation and destruction, and of growth and decay, are mirrored both without and within, that it's not just the external world that is so gamified. The workings of psyche are also highly conflicted. A human being could survive a car crash, or lose a grandparent, or watch a gruesome film on Monday and feel almost nothing. That same human being could then also break down into a gibbering wreck the following Friday after seeing a photograph of a dog collar, or hearing a particular song on the radio. And they may have never even owned a dog, and it might not even be a song they've heard before. Just like nature, the mind is a delicate, all too often unpredictable system, a synthesis of hormones and memories, of motivations, rewards, and sorrows. For every weird, undiscovered orchid, starfish, or microbe is some equally esoteric combination of hormonally, genetically, and situationally induced human notions. Some exquisitely precise fabric of ideas, moods, and aesthetics, bound together with subconscious observations. And everything affects that fabric, from the macro right down to the micro, both externally and within us. Everything we take in, what we observe, consume, or entertain, however we may participate, actively or passively, life is shedding its residue, constantly, affecting not only space-time and nature, but also consciousness. Chrono Cross, among numerous other ideas, celebrates the interconnectedness of nature, space-time, and consciousness. It knows that nothing is intrinsically separate from, well, anything. That what appears to separate us from each other, from the planet, from the greater universe, even from ourselves, is little more than a lens of interpretation. A perceptual language which, per the demands of linear biological consciousness, confines the scope of our awareness, thus affecting a very convincing dream. A dream that time flows in one direction and that life must be one way and not another. In this way, the game calls the entirety of human experience into question, introducing a few baffling lenses of abstraction, while simultaneously warning of the dangers of getting too lost in the tides of self-exploration, often returning to the ubiquitous metaphor of the sea, which at once signifies the oneness of consciousness and of time, the permanence of impermanence, the ordered chaos of nature, and the destiny and origin of life. The sea, in the game's varied and overlapping metaphors, is itself a contradiction. We fear its wrath, yet we rely upon it for survival, and in every culture it is a source of both anxiety and peace. In my opinion, Chrono Cross equates the ocean's depths with greater self-awareness, suggesting that self-discovery and understanding the origins of life ultimately are one and the same. That if we really want to understand and therefore improve the human condition going forward, First, we need to go all the way back. As with Trigger, Cross suggests that the pursuit of identity and self-actualization are at once a signifier of higher consciousness, that is, future-oriented consciousness, and indeed a significant mark of evolution, and yet unimaginably destructive when divorced from the wisdom of the past. That higher consciousness is inevitable, and that every planet capable of generating life has the potential for self-actualization, but that this is also an immensely difficult transition, for every world, likely for each individual thereon, perhaps for the universe as a whole. Chrono Cross also implies that there is a new phase of consciousness awaiting us, the next crucial step in our evolution, which may bring about a much higher, much stabler, much finer order, if we can get through this particularly difficult transition. But until that time comes, ours remains a precarious, unlikely harmony, which not only permits but requires hellish suffering, sacrifice, and disorder. And the greater the consciousness, the greater the stakes, and the harder we'll fall if we fail. Melchior might call this current phase a birthing, perhaps even rebirthing process, a kind of necessary agony. As with all life, we must adapt through every epoch, or be annihilated in the attempt. This is, of course, also true within our psychology. After all, in every way that matters, for us, evolution and psychology are one and the same. As without, so within. As within, so without.
In the Chrono series, there's a very real sense in which we are neither more nor less than the planet experiencing itself. The planet lends us consciousness as we live and breathe, and so too do we lend consciousness to the planet.
This dual essence of human psychology can thus be perceived as an aspect of the planet itself, seen more or less in all created things. In the literal text, the idea of separate opposing wills is explored along several axes. We have Lavos versus the entity, Lavos versus Schala, fate versus destiny, Serge versus Lynx, Serge versus Lavos, homeworld versus another world, humans versus draconians, and fate versus the dragon god. But the subtext, I believe, wants us to question if there is yet a deeper will at play. What, if anything, is ultimately guiding that process? Whatever the case may be, we're shown that, at the deepest levels of the game's awareness, where, who, and howsoever those might reside, there is something resembling a contest of wills. Some essential aspect of Serge's world is at odds with itself.
Perhaps nowhere is this conflict better represented than in humanity's relationship with the supernatural.
Magic plays a crucial role in every major war and during every significant life-altering moment. But let me just take a moment to ask, what even is magic in the Chrono universe, when we have such a dizzying blend of soft and hard magical systems, time travel, psychic abilities, science fiction, and natural mysticism? Magic seems to result from the planet's will, from the sun's energy, from special minerals, machines, and other artifacts, from genetics, from human consciousness, from powerful elemental beings, possibly from aliens, and possibly even from imagination, dreams, or even deep conversations. We'll never answer that question. In most cases, the magic is, of course, just whatever makes for an interesting story from moment to moment. So instead, let's talk about what's going on symbolically in this game. In Chrono Cross, the most powerful magic by far belongs to the Draconians, then later the demi-humans. In this game, any powerful magic used by humans, or even by fate itself, is ultimately borrowed therefrom. During their prime, the Draconians demonstrated reality-bending feats, rivaled only by the likes of the Enlightened Ones and the Mystics in Chrono Trigger, and surpassed only by the likes of Lavos himself. Terra Tower and later on Fort Dragonia are testaments to these abilities. which soften the apparent laws of nature without necessarily breaking them or relying on digital technologies. But their most powerful magic, besides the Chrono Cross, is their Dragon God, who comprises all 6 of the game's natural elements. The Dragon God in defeat is separated into 6 equal parts. When in victory, however, it is presumed to be greater than the sum of its parts, likely stronger than any being on the planet, save again for Lavos. Like many things in the series, the Dragon God embodies a unified whole, and as such, the dragon's magic is at its most potent when used in harmony. An act of black elemental magic is defined by the existence of white. Green is defined by yellow, an act of red by blue, and so forth. I would say that Draconian magic is best understood like a painting, where no single brushstroke reveals its full purpose outside of the context of the complete work. In other words, any conscious understanding of Draconian magic in of itself requires a very different mode of cognition. We can fire off as many blue or red or yellow spells as we like, but until we master the holistic Draconian cognitive style, our innate understanding remains limited at best. And for the average modern human, relating to this mindset would seem nearly impossible. I mentioned in my trigger video that humanity more or less lost its magical abilities in lockstep with the rise of technology and a decreased reliance upon the Earth's provision. Well, similarly, I don't think it's a stretch to posit that the demi-humans' natural inborn use of magic might have been the result of their maintaining a closer degree of contact with the planet itself, a process which likely deepened rather than lessened over time. So, basically, in Chrono Cross, evolutionary dominance splits down 2 essential paths. One leads to dominance through reason and deliberate suppression of mystical experience. The other attains comparable awareness by deepening its connection to the planet and embracing intuition, faith, and mysticism. Technically, humans, such as those residing in Galdov, can access either state. But Draconians, literally speaking, stand as the purest embodiment of the latter, whilst humanity, in contrast, drifts ever further from its mystical origins. Naturally, their incompatibility is not merely one of biology, but of fundamental worldview, of how each relates to magic, to the elements, and to existence itself.
If we take the demi-humans less literally, they expose something intrinsic in us, an inherent aspect of human consciousness that seeks above all else to understand and reunite with its source.
As the offspring of Draconians and humans, they embody the painful dissonance between logic and intuition, thinking and feeling, knowledge and understanding, individuality and collective consciousness. They represent an evolutionary what-if, a path where humanity might have elevated its primal awareness differently, becoming wilder in some respects while more sensitive in others. In this sense, their presence speaks to the latent part of ourselves that modernity has repressed, a connection to archetypes, symbols, and deep intuitive knowing, what some might even call magic. The most mystically inclined demi-humans, and demi-human adjacent, believe that every interaction between life forms is felt by nature itself. To them, how one treats another is how one treats all living things, for all are bound by time, memory, and genetics. Not many among us would validate such interconnectedness. Many would reject it as unscientific, incongruous, or even incompatible with individuality and free will. But if we can at least imagine being on either side of that argument, then we may already understand the grander conflict at the heart of Chrono Cross. In effect, the planet is at war with itself. Life wants consistency, and it wants freedom. Life wants peace, and it wants power. Life wants harmony, and it wants individuality. And achieving that kind of equilibrium is, well, synthesis in perpetuity. Otherwise, it would take a kind of miracle, a kind of statistical masterpiece. And as far as most humans are concerned, the only brushstroke that doesn't quite seem to fit into that perfect painting is freedom.
Personally, though, I'm rather fond of the idea that true freedom is attained not by breaking out of the web of creation, but rather through accepting its entirety. I suspect Chrono agrees with me.
Some, myself included, believe that there are no true actors of will, save for those who act with awareness and with intent upon the entire matrix. This, theoretically, is magic. Submit the will unto the web of eternity, and the true will in eternity shall echo forth. Think of it this way. When the wave crashes down, it's not losing its precious little self within a sea of indifference, but rather regaining its whole self, its true self. I think this is what the demi-humans believe. We're mortal, everything is impermanent. A living wave, like ourselves, could only ever be in motion, else it was always inert, always dead. And how much lovelier should my own little drop of self feel, once rejoined with its source, perhaps awakened thereupon to its complete self.
But I'm a glass has always been an illusion and all waters are one water kind of person.
Unfortunately, like the humans, the Draconians were not immune to the corruptions of fear and hatred. They worked more closely with the planet's internal energies, but in the end, their perspective was also incomplete. For better or worse, they lacked the higher reasoning of the humans, and through their creations expressed a kind of debilitating single-mindedness, which limited their capacity for growth, almost for the opposite reason from the humans. There is a kind of tyranny in nature, a relentless pull towards equilibrium that, without the temperance of higher consciousness, rarely accounts for extenuating circumstances, and even when conscious is highly susceptible to trickery. Thus, the Draconians of Cross, not unlike the mystics of Trigger, gradually lost the battle for dominance. The Earth's natural magic was swallowed into the abyss of reason, consumed, measured, demystified, and commodified. Now, I know that the use of elements is still perceived as magical, perhaps even miraculous by the humans, but let's pay attention to the fact that none of the real magic, none of the deep stuff, the good stuff, the most powerful mysteries, are accessible unless through the ancient Draconian magic, which is shown to be less defined, less categorical, and even more intuitive. Magic which seems a little less studied and a little more felt. The deepest forms of magic are concentrated almost exclusively within remote, sometimes abandoned Draconian territories, where the elder mysteries are submerged so deeply that even the demi-humans are starting to forget them. Now, quite naturally, the avatar of the Draconians, who has observed the long, painful suppression of magic and mystical consciousness, has developed a kind of nihilistic outlook by the time Serge confronts it. The dragon god almost appears to prefer the barbarism of nature, dwelling upon life's inescapable cost of grief and violence, and no longer appreciating the joys of continuity. This, to me, felt highly symbolic of our own conflicted natures.
Let's be less literal again for a second.
I often think back to that moment in Chrono Trigger where the Queen of the Reptites confronts the reality of her own extinction, and the trajectory of the evolutionary race is sort of compressed into one pivotal cutscene. Azala knew that the Reptites were superior, for a while at least, during their peak. However, once she finally loses, she displays a chilling degree of acceptance in regards to her fate. For me, this felt symbolic of one interesting distinction between reptilian and primate psychology in the Chrono series, but also kind of in real life as well. The humans, oriented forward, see things for what they could be, what they might become. The Reptites, oriented backward, see things for what they are. Well, actually, if we're brutally honest, the reptiles see things for what they appear to be, which is fine if you have a big, strong body and so long as nothing ever changes. During the cutscene, the future-focused humans offer to rescue Schala, who was their greatest enemy. Why? I think it's because they are capable of imagining, even after years of bitter struggle, perhaps even because of it, some possibility of cooperation going forward. Alas, in this version of events, annihilation came knocking a little too early for the reptiles. Nothing had yet developed within them to allow for this change. And as far as those reptiles were concerned, defeat was already written in the stars, decreed by nature long ago. They would die fighting, yes, but as reptiles, who could not ally with humans any more than they could survive the long cold. In our own lineage, somewhere along the way, imagination became necessary for survival, in part because things are so often not what they appear to be. My human mind declares that red thing might not be the berry I think it is. On another day it declares conversely, I'm cold, alone, hungry. Those sinister-looking strangers beside the fire could be friendly. I've already covered a great deal about this in my trigger video, where I talked about evolution, our reptilian ancestry, the development of higher reasoning, primeval collective consciousness, Lavos, the sunstone, the red rocks, and more. What I haven't talked about quite as much is the evolutionary tug-of-war that rages on inside us to this day. The demi-humans, narratively speaking, provide an intermediate step between reptilian and primate physiology, which, for better or worse, also introduces a figurative step between primeval and modern strains of consciousness, an echo of something older and less direct, something drifting at the margins of our collective memory. They appear to be masters of domains which we can no longer quite access, remnants of a time in which the world seems to have felt a little more fluid, a little more uncanny. During an age when survival depended upon instinct in lieu of certainty, like a maze we could never quite master, which blurred the lines between dreams and reality. But to those humans who have learned to integrate and activate their own latent mystical consciousness, the differences appear less stark, perhaps even subtle. Chrono suggests that if all life shares a common ancestry, then perhaps there is also a kind of not only collective but universal consciousness, which, once bridged, can reveal the human part of the animal part of the human, and if we dare to take it a little further, perhaps even the animal part of the plant part of the water of air, the air of fire, and so forth. It reminds us that there is significant continuity between every speck of dust, every thought, dream, and memory, every planet and every star, every moment, and every overlapping outcome. And this strange dreamlike alchemy, to find the rock of air, the space of light, the fire of ice, well, that's what we might call elemental magic. A world in which all living things, perhaps even non-living things, are revealed to possess elemental affiliations, basically serving as checks and balances to one another. And although the elemental system in Chrono was intended foremost to serve as a gameplay mechanic, I think it also serves to remind us in yet another way that all living beings, from the lowliest beach bum to the mighty dragon god, are made out of the same basic cosmic building blocks. And again, as without, so within. So while each elemental island and its corresponding dragon in El Nido describes a different component of nature, they can also, in my opinion, delineate different aspects of human experience.
Now I'm going to break down all the elements in Chrono and describe their physical and metaphysical relationships with one another.
The blue element is deeply tied to the themes of ancient collective memory and dreams, representing the primordial ocean, the birthplace of all life, and therefore the origin of consciousness itself. This dreamlike aesthetic is emphasized both in the fight with the dragon and on the island itself. This entire encounter is accompanied by the peaceful Garden of God theme, rather than the regular boss music, reinforcing an atmosphere of peace, reverence, and reflection rather than aggression. The blue dragon itself speaks in a slow, poetic manner and exudes a diplomatic, patient presence. I already mentioned this during my analysis of Frog in my trigger video, but its amphibious form can also imply a callback to an earlier stage of human evolution, a kind of liminal space between past and present, giving it a whimsical fairy tale feeling reminiscent of Trigger's Middle Ages. Whether or not this association was intended, it was further emphasized by the presence of the dragon's frog prince servant, who is most definitely connected to Frog's story, and is associated with simpler times. I'd say that the Water Dragon Isle is also one of the most classically beautiful locations in the game, teeming with flowers, fairies, and untouched natural splendor, and I kind of felt like the entire sequence exuded a kind of dreamlike innocence. On this island, we're reminded of the primordial realms of myth, such as the fairy realm in European folklore, or even the Garden of Eden, or the Esper world, the Mana Sanctuary, or perhaps the world in Terranigma before the humans arrive. A place where man does not quite know himself. The red element stands as an equal and opposite force to blue. If blue magic represents the deep, continuous, collective dream of consciousness, perhaps red magic is the spark that pulls life forward. The drive towards individuation and higher consciousness, much like the Promethean flame I discussed in my previous video, or even the frozen flame itself. Just as ancient life in the sea evolved by rising towards the heat of the sun, red magic represents the fiery force of change, the impulse to grow, to explore, and transform. This theme is reflected in the red dragon, whose very presence contrasts sharply with its blue counterpart. It appears smaller, walking on two legs, somewise reminiscent of humanity, and its casual, almost modern affect, especially as contrasted with the archaic speech of the other dragons, lends a sense of immediacy and forward momentum. The red dragon is also brash and impatient. It is apparently the most eager to fight, challenging the party not once but twice, with battle themes that are appropriately aggressive. Even during the fight itself, the fire dragon undergoes a transformation, reinforcing the red element's dynamism and changeability. In other words, where the blue element evokes stillness, acceptance, and oneness, life sleeping in its eternal womb of slime, so to speak, the red part of the dragon god is the most consciously willing to make waves, the most consciously willing in general. In doing so, it offers every life form some chance of aspiring beyond slime. The soul of red says, yes, we're all connected, and we're all unique. The red dragon's domain can also subtly suggest thematic ties to progress and power. Mount Pyre is not only the largest and most perilous of the elemental territories, but it also surrounds Fort Dragonia, an ancient technological installation, and, fittingly, is also the closest to human civilization and military presence, further reinforcing Fire's connection to ambition, destruction, and progress. But for humans, Draconians, and beyond, this radical aspect in part owes its existence to the waters of collective memory. For together, red and blue embody the powers of imagination and insight, via the union of conscious will and unconscious dream, and therefore the hopes of all living beings. We see the dynamics of blue and red play out through characters such as Nikki and Mickey, whose collaborative talents combine the daring passions of red with the haunted yearnings of blue. Similarly, Lena and Kid kind of embody humanity's conflicted drives towards commitment, tradition, and family on the one hand, versus ambition, discovery, and excitement on the other. Sadly, none of the other red party members got any meaningful development, but several other blue characters do also express connections to the themes of unity and family, such as Nikki's father, Fargo, a heartbroken sailor with magical children, once a romantic soul and husband of a mermaid. Also Irenes, his mermaid sister-in-law, who longs to bring the estranged magical family back together, and especially to heal the divide between the humans and demi-humans. And maybe I'll also mention Korcha, a family-driven ferryman who falls in love with Kid and fights for the rights of the demi-humans.
The blue and red elements stand apart in Chrono Cross, yet their interplay with the other four is just as vital, as I'll be exploring throughout this video.
At a glance, the yellow and green elements seem less overtly opposed than blue and red or white and black. Yet, their relationship is one of foundation and transformation, of inertia and emergence. The yellow element, earth and electricity, suggests a static force, both literally and figuratively, representing the energetic underpinnings of matter and chemistry. Yellow is what red transforms and what blue dissolves. It is in our blood, in the land, in the sea, in all plants and animals, even in space. Green, in contrast, is what happens when yellow officially becomes alive. The raw materials of yellow, when arranged with perfect precision, produce the miracle of life, and of movement. Just as red moves blue into awareness and transformation, green moves yellow into lower entropy, into something dynamic and self-sustaining. Yet it's also the physical interplay between yellow's energies that allows biology to emerge in the first place. Seemingly inert materials, when arranged correctly and exposed to the proper conditions, become something that walks, breathes, loves, kills, creates, and dies. The relationship between these elements subtly suggests that perhaps not only animals and plants, but everything is alive. After all, with the tiniest tweaks, a dead nothing is suddenly a living something. The earth dragon embodies yellow's nature, stout, stoic, humble, vast. It comes across as ancient yet neutral, a kind of detached observer, existing outside the struggles of passion or ambition. And, like the blue dragon, its battle is accompanied by the serene Garden of God theme. Its home, Earth Dragon Isle, is similarly meditative. A blank, sacred space of sand and silence, empty yet peacefully immaculate. Gaia's navel, by contrast, where green is strongest, teems with creatures in chaotic abundance, and the green dragon itself is driven foremost by hunger. It is fitting that green, the force which propels life, would be intrinsically tied to consumption. The maintenance of life demands fuel. A plant requires vastly more energy to hold together than a rock, to say nothing of an ant, a mouse, or a human brain. Naturally, the regular boss music accompanies this fight, for the green dragon, more than any other, is shamelessly animalistic, portrayed as treacherous and even venomous, and ruled by instinct rather than reason. Unlike the earth dragon, it has little interest in the party, speaking the least of all the dragons, a different kind of neutrality. Green reminds us that life exists because it must. It's not personal. Yellow is timeless, a mere side effect of exploding stars. Green emerges in fleeting moments, an attribute well suited to both wind and living beings. Yellow and green together show us unapologetically what we are in the purely physical sense. Where blue and red hint at who we are, how we got here, and what we might become, yellow and green remind us of the complex dynamic systems that preserve our existence in the first place. They are the stuff of life. We may not like it, but at the end of the day, all of us are limited physical beings. And sometimes those baser drives towards self-preservation are necessary. In Chrono Cross, the green magic reminds us that this too represents something intrinsically sacred, a thing to be honored. It reminds us that life itself grew like a beautiful garden out of the bones of the earth, and that each living thing has a right to exist, a right to try its luck within the fast-paced, all too often chaotic and competitive world. Because life is worth it. Life itself is sweeter than any berry, lovelier than any mate, and warmer than any bed. So, moving on to yellow and green characters, before I get into some of the deeper archetypal relationships, certain yellow players, such as Lord Viper, Zoa, Norris, and Leah, sometimes embody a kind of staunch, humble, staying power, usually somewhat stoic and highly practical. And maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but we've also got a few green characters whose stories emphasize the caprice, preciousness, variety, or fragility of natural selection, including Sprig, Glenn, Radius, Karsh, and Rasley. But, again, most of them sadly don't get a whole lot of character development. But we can think of these two elements as representing a kind of biological drama, which is a complement to the more ethereal, somewhat more personal drama of blue and red.
And this leads me to black and white, the cosmic drama.
The black and white elements would seem to imply the most absolute of dualities. Dark and light, mystery and revelation, the dynamic forces of space-time itself. Yet, like time and space, and indeed the other elemental forces, they're not truly opposed, but rather express a single continuum, one which necessarily comprises the other four. Where blue and red encourage transformation and yellow and green infuse our physical being, black and white force us to confront the scale of all things, for simply acknowledging the black and white elements within ourselves requires us to acknowledge the entirety of the universe. On the cosmic scale, existence defines and is defined by non-existence. Black must be so that white can become. Each in their way embodies a kind of void, one an abyss of endless potential, the other an all-encompassing singularity. Their spells speak of heaven and hell, of light and darkness, order and chaos, eternity and entropy. They are the cosmic dance at its grandest scale. The way I see it, white, Serge's element, represents an ever-moving force that orders and effectively enables reality. This we could even call time, and this is just a side note, but I believe this also could have been Chrono's element in lieu of yellow's lightning if the themes had been developed in the same way. For, like Chrono and Serge, white is very much a representation of the eternal moment, or the eternal now. Its counterpart, vast and inert, could therefore represent space, an eternity of never. The darkness seems to be the oldest element in the universe, existing before light, before time, before substance, energy, life, or consciousness. It is the only element we cannot destroy, and the only thing left over when everything else is gone. And black, we intuitively understand, is the first and final mystery, a primordial silence from which, somehow, existence emerged.
It makes you go mad if you think about it too long, but it's also pretty groovy.
None of those 5 interconnected somethings can exist without the boundless nothing of black. And yet, we fear this element above all else. I think this is because the void, once mingled and contrasted with light, life, and awareness, reveals something we did not wish to see, both within the world and within ourselves. All the things we might prefer to banish into oblivion, and especially those things which stand readily apart from what we consider to be natural or life-affirming experiences. The darkness is inherently uncanny, thus associated with the distortion or even transgression of the known. Its very existence reveals the dark underside of the other 5, and reflects the universe back at itself by showing us everything we are not. Conforming simply to the negative spaces of reality, black is the only truly unbiased force, being the only thing which is truly empty. If we try to penetrate it, it swallows us whole, and it's always there, eating away at us every single moment of our lives. Black's indifference to life appears especially horrific when contrasted with the seemingly merciful and life-affirming white. White magic in battle, more than most other elements, is oriented toward healing and protection. Black, meanwhile, subjects its opponents not merely to destruction, but to erasure, to a force that leaves no trace. But sometimes white too annihilates, and black also heals. Where black erases indiscriminately, its complement remains eternally aspirational, representing a force so absolute as to remain beyond compromise and beyond comprehension. Black and white therefore need the colored elements, which altogether allow for the universe to exist in the first place, to be shaped, felt, and lived in all its exquisite imperfection. The two dragons, neither of which, curiously enough, feature the Garden of God battle theme, communicate these themes further. The sky dragon stands in ceremony, high above the rest, seemingly the most noble and orderly of the six. It is near angelic in form, bestowing the party with a celestial summon, and it will not fight the party until after they've earned the other 5 elemental relics. In other words, it seeks to complete and therefore unify the set, and to enforce the order of things. The black dragon is asleep when the player encounters it, existing seemingly without need or purpose, until it is disturbed. It fights the player for the exercise, then thanks the party for the excitement before bestowing a hellish summon. This too suggests inert chaos, craving form. Black is nothingness which must interact with something in order to be known. And returning to psychological implications, I think the black element, more than any other, enables us to know ourselves. Ultimately, it is only in total isolation, away from distractions, removed from ideas, from work, survival, ambition, that we can see ourselves clearly. I think the black element reveals who we are by reminding us of everything we're not. Indeed, we cannot encounter anything in black excepting what we ourselves bring into it. So, for this reason, I think it's pretty fitting that the demi-humans have migrated to Marbul, living alongside the black dragon. Like the darkness it embodies, their presence is an inconvenient reminder of a past humanity had much rather forget. Pushed to the margins, long after the war has ended, the demi-humans are a living shadow of history's cruelties. Some intended, others accidental, and, by extension, the unconscious collective memories associated therewith. This aspect of the dichotomy is exemplified in Serge and Lynx, and especially in Serge and Harle, and I'll be saying a lot more about them in a moment. But otherwise, the most notable white element characters are Starkey, Riddle, Stina, and Doc, who each possess an impeccably strong moral and ethical drive, which resonates with the wise and merciful aspirations of white. Starkey, originally tasked with judging humanity's worthiness, realizes how little he understands and thus chooses mercifully. Doc is passionately devoted to healing, Stina preserves the traditional wisdom of the Draconians, and Riddle devotes herself to a humanitarian cause. And overall, the black element characters are either representative of something other or somewhat beyond the natural order, or demonstrate a high degree of willingness to alter reality, as seen in Lynx, Harle, Mojo, Grobic, and Mother Brain, all of whom enjoy somewhat of an aberrant existence, as well as Guile and Lucia, whose arcane practices seem somewhat questionable. In Chrono Cross, just as the shades need the colors need the shades. The balance of black and white work together to prevent the entropic states introduced by each of the others. Metaphorically, too much yellow is inertia, while too much green is cancer. Too much blue means apathy, yet too much red means self-detonation. And as I've been insinuating throughout this video, none of them can truly exist separately, perhaps for this very reason. Intrinsically, or insofar as human experience is concerned, each elemental force must reflect, shape, define, and contain the others. It's not even a choice, it just is. The so-called Draconian elemental magic is in everything. It's every degree of power predicated upon this very understanding.
But if that magic had a voice, what would it say to us?
The entity understood that Earth's evolution required specific challenges to be met within a specific order. When that order was threatened by fate, it brought forth the Dragon God. But, like fate, even in its original world, the very existence of the Dragon God seems at once natural and unnatural, neither quite harmonious with the greater universe, nor quite a transgression therein. And again, what seems neither entirely natural nor unnatural, likewise seems as sentient and alive as it is robotic and impersonal. Whether the Draconian's magic arose from a conscious force or entity is never entirely confirmed. Similarly, while it's stated that the Dragon God was created by the Draconians from a formless mass of plasma, many questions remain. For instance, was this thing a pre-existing entity or archetype effectively summoned or otherwise brought into being, or an entirely artificial construct?
Yes.
Furthermore, was the Dragon God ever conscious, or is it only Harle, its offshoot, who is conscious? To which universe, if any, did the Draconians actually belong? And the questions don't stop there. The Dragon God, like magic, remains permanently mysterious and permanently paradoxical. But by asking these sorts of questions, I believe we're at least getting closer to understanding both Harle and the Dragon God itself. For now, I'll start by saying, I think that while the Fate Engine is all about constructing reality from the top down, the Dragon God, and especially Harle, is about deconstructing reality. Unlike Lynx, who is a threatening ambassador of an imposing reality, Harle presents as a fairly playful ambassador of unreality, addressing Serge in a seductive, indirect and teasing manner. From the moment we meet her, Harle challenges us to consider the wider scope of possibilities, and to confront the inherent absurdity of clinging to life, love, and reality in a universe that is in constant flux, in which life is constantly competing, suffering, and dying. Harle, unlike fate, is embracing the chaos of nature, perhaps to an extreme degree. She is also embracing not knowing in lieu of fate's obsessive need to predict and understand everything. I suspect the Dragon God is well aware that its own timeline is neither quite valid nor entirely invalid.
And yeah, that feels pretty weird to the uninitiated.
On the one hand, the Draconians are akin to foreign invaders within this keystone timeline. On the other hand, they didn't choose to be sent there, any more than each person chooses to be born. Harle never asks us not to fight for our lives. I mean, she more than anyone understands that instinct. But her presence does invite us to honor those who have lost in the game of life. Perhaps by simply recognizing the precariousness of our own existence. She inspires us to remember, maybe even to love those other species who didn't make it. The Draconians, like the humans, could only ever make the best of what they were given, and Harle, who by this point has spent millennia on the losing side of that deal, likely perceives that no one truly has any special right to exist. From her point of view, it's all just arbitrary. Anything could be taken away in an instant, so why cling to any kind of ideal about what might be or what should be? Really, we ought to just embrace reality as it unfolds. You're here now, and things are different. There's no right or wrong about anyone trying to survive, especially when the rules keep changing. Even when Serge is forced into Lynx's body, Harle insists that he should just accept that he is Lynx. Maybe he always was. What truly is the difference? After all, if a mighty elemental Gog can be defeated by a human-made computer, then believing that we have any real control over the universe must be arrogant. Just like in real life, very important dragons with wounded pride tend to retreat into the absurd. It gives them a new kind of power. If they can't change reality, then they ought to change themselves into something capable of withstanding reality's caprice. Maybe something like a jester who can ignore reality's walls altogether, since the walls have proved to be meaningless.
Harle's philosophy empowers Serge and the player to do the very same, encouraging us to consider the ways in which fixed reality was always an illusion, that having rigid expectations will only slow us down.
Like, if you're given a zucchini, even though you clearly planted a watermelon, you can't just scream loudly that there is no zucchini while ignoring the evidence of your eyes and taste buds. It's still a zucchini, so you can do nothing, or you can make a stir-fry. Or maybe you can trade it for some other fruit. But when something really uncanny happens, like something comes along and knocks us into a much crappier universe where our lives are fractured into barely recognizable pieces, our expectations will either drastically worsen, or, if the event was surprising enough, disappear altogether. I think it's safe to say that Harle doesn't really trust reality. From her point of view, there's a tyrannical computer controlling everything that happens in her world. But let's be honest here, many of you watching have probably had some version of that thought by now. In many respects, our world feels, perhaps even is, exactly like an artificially constructed experience, in which highly advanced, manipulative algorithms are predicting our thoughts, opinions, and behaviors, steering our decisions, and contaminating our relationships. And we're supposed to just trust, as we plug into all these systems, that we know what we're doing and why, leave alone who or what is really in control. I kind of relate to Harle in this respect. It's actually a lot simpler not to trust anything or anyone. But even that kind of mindset is easy for Fate, and by extension, Lavos, to manipulate. Harle started out fully intending to enforce the Dragon God's will. She would destroy Fate, bring the Dragon God back online, and allow it to dominate the Earth, even if that meant destroying humanity. But after spending some time with Serge and the other humans, she wasn't sure anymore. Something inside her began to shift. Yes, the Draconians were more respectful of nature, more peaceful even among themselves. Yes, they deserved to be avenged, and their descendants deserved to be in power. But Harle, once an avatar of the Dragon God whose very existence bespoke unanimous equilibrium, somewhere along the way had acquired her own personality, and that separate identity on some level realized that the Draconian perspective was incomplete. Now, there's actually some similarity between this situation and that of Kid versus Schala. Not only does Harle replace Kid within the party, but both Kid and Harle were also sent into another world in order to embody the personalities of magical beings more powerful than themselves. Both Schala and the Dragon God hail from the evolutionary peaks of their respective civilizations, and both Kid and Harle develop romantic feelings towards Serge. The competitive relationship between Harle and Kid can also be seen as symbolic of the two competitive realities vying for existence. The other reality, in which the reptites are dominant, is almost represented as a kind of alternative love interest. To Kid, Harle is the other woman and vice versa. From an even less literal standpoint, Serge, the one who actually controls both of their fates, is kind of like the ultimate prize. Serge can love both of them, but due to their contradictory natures, only one version of events can be active at a time. And I'm going off the rails a bit here, but this is also kind of a macrocosm of all the various other events which force Serge and the player to choose between characters, locking us out of relationships with certain party members, or even ending the lives of others. No matter which path Serge treads, Chrono Cross reminds us that despite our best intentions, we can't help everybody, no matter how peaceful, kind, or strategic our endeavors. Someone is always going to get hurt. Some events, personalities, species, and even realities are fundamentally incompatible. In the story of Chrono Cross, the two worlds, Homeworld and Another World, are virtually identical except for one aspect. In one world, Serge drowns at a young age, whereas in the other, he survives. Okay, that wasn't quite true. The two worlds exhibit radical differences, up to and including the return of Lavos. But these differences are all implied to be massively entangled with Serge's fate. Serge, like Chrono, occupies a very significant position within the timeline, which is why Lynx initially refers to him as the Chrono Trigger. Chrono himself, another character whose death sends ripples throughout space-time, was also a Chrono Trigger. Serge, like Chrono, is both alive and dead.
Well, that might be true for all of us, though most of us are not Chrono Triggers. Probably. More on that later.
A Chrono Trigger is a person or object in time symbolically represented by an egg, that is, massively entangled with the fabric of space-time. The physical aspect of this whole idea, time eggs, Chrono Triggers, whether these are the same or different, whether it's always an egg, that was all left very mysterious. But I don't think it matters. The idea symbolically, and I'll be talking a bit more about this in a little while too, is that a new universe awakens or hatches during dynamic fluctuations of probability. Chrono's statistically miraculous actions make him a Chrono Trigger, but much of this also revolves around his exchanges with his friends. Both games emphasize our importance within reality as being primarily an aspect of our effect on others around us, rather than who we are as individuals. As far as the universe is concerned, we're all silent protagonists, whose choices and circumstances may or may not significantly contribute to its wider evolution. So, think carefully about which of these fancy gentlemen truly matters most to the plot. I'll give you a hint. It's whichever one Serge chooses. In the series, many instances of time travel introduce drastic alterations into the timeline, but an actual Chrono Trigger involves dramatic intervention from outside of time, such as those activated during the moments of Serge's death and of Chrono's death. Really, it's more like supernatural intervention, the side effects of which sometimes involve people or objects getting displaced from time, phasing between alternate realities, or even encountering copies of themselves. In both games, the Chrono Trigger's primary modes of intervention typically instigate the player's quest, requiring her to fix what is broken in time. However, this game makes sure we understand that not only are neither of these two worlds truer than the other, but indeed that no single reality is more valid or deserving of existence than another. In the later game, both the Ghost Children and Luca's letter drive this point home, expressing the inherent injustice of erasing a future, even a cataclysmic one, and the inevitability of suffering on any timeline. In her letter, Luca even admits to having a guilty conscience for getting involved with time travel in the first place, lamenting the instability of any such alterations in a universe that allows for time travel. And I think a lot of people would feel that way, perceiving that, at any moment, someone else is concurrently discovering space-time travel and planning to undo everything, the bad and the good. That is, after all, what Luca did, and is still doing elsewhere and elsewhen.
And there's a cold, uncanny, lonely terror in that thought.
Chrono Cross, among other things, is about meeting the self. And that particular idea is explored in numerous ways throughout the game, in terms of psychology, philosophy, and even physics. And by that I mean fantasy physics. Firstly, there are clones of every character, and they each react differently to meeting themselves. This is one of the most entertaining things in the game. We were shown all kinds of colorful presentations and extra dialogue when we took the time to present them before their proverbial mirrors. Their various attitudes towards their clones typically revealed aspects of their personalities, what was important, how they felt about themselves, or some of the major dilemmas or conflicts within their lives. Very often, one of the clones was deeper than the other, usually less self-assured, and consequently more inclined to join the party in their pursuit of meaning, love, knowledge, power, or resolution. But the pursuit of meaning was typically the most important, because the player's quest is just that, an examination of humanity's quest for meaning and significance in a boundless multiverse.
One very important aspect of meeting the self is coming to grips with one's own impact within the greater world.
Alongside the development of identity, as we each mature and find our places within the tribe, comes an ever-increasing awareness of external cause and effect, responsibility and culpability. At first, a child understands his or her role and impact within the family, and then neighbors, the village, the local environments, and finally, the wider community and ecosystem. If the child is well educated, or especially empathetic, however, this can go much further. They will come to understand their place within their continent, their planet, and even the universe. But this level of awareness is both empowering and sobering. Serge's story emphasizes this concept in many highly symbolic ways, particularly the fact that, in the universe in which Serge survives, Lavos is fated to return. This outcome takes the notion of culpability to its most catastrophic conclusion. Serge, being the child chosen by fate, is the most powerful being in existence. He is the yes and no of existence, and everything hinges on his actions and his survival. Alas, if he chooses to ignore the responsibility inherent of his unique position, if he wants to just have a normal life, if he ignores the summons to adulthood, his very existence will instigate a sequence of events leading to a cataclysm of unprecedented proportion. Basically, the message is, if you want to be a separate entity, be my guest, but here's the price of singularity. Your entire universe will collapse around you. Serge, going against the grain of reality, was given back his life, but the story also forces him to accept that that life isn't really his, and perhaps never was.
If you allow it, Chrono Cross will impose no end of horrifying, intoxicating questions.
If there are infinite versions of me, then which, if any of them, is the real me? Are any of them the real me? Are all of them the real me? Like, what does it really even mean if my entire life is just a smeary superposition of chance? Do any of these universes even matter in that case? Why do some of them live while others die? Why do some versions of me live comfortable, wonderful lives, whilst others suffer endlessly? Is there any point in trying to change it? What even determines which version of reality, and therefore which version of self, is rendered at a given moment? And why am I this conscious observer in this universe and not that one? Like, not that one directly next to me if it's the same except for that one ozone molecule. Or maybe I'm conscious in both of those. The same mind, but only aware of one. Am I even conscious, or am I part of someone or something else's reality, or perhaps even someone or something else's dream? Like, there's a bigger me and a bigger reality out there, and it experiences all of me, and I'm just a drop in that sea of consciousness.
And it all just goes around and around, always circling back to that most ancient of existential questions. Who are we, and why are we here?
As I've implied, there's this idea throughout the series of a kind of magical distortion of probability. Some events which, somehow, manage to squeeze through the curtains of reality, if we follow the aforementioned lines of questioning to their natural conclusions, will start to transition out of logic, out of rationality, and into mystery, absurdity, and even faith. We'll get old-fashioned, even draconian. I mean, here's probably the simplest yet hardest question of all time, that almost everyone has asked, yet nobody can fully answer. How did our universe come into being? One answer is that it didn't. It always was. We'll probably never know how. Sure, we can measure and date all sorts of things. We can look at charts and infer some very long histories. But no matter how far back we're able to construe, something must have happened first. And if we manage to unravel it further, discovering perhaps that something came from nothing, or some existence beyond time and space, we're still left with the why. And that is an infinitely worse question. We don't get to know why. I don't think it fits into human understanding. I think it's always going to be that little thing that's just beyond our reach. That thing that makes it all make sense. On the one hand, we're nowhere near that thing. On the other hand, it's in everything. It's in you and me, and it's all around us. It's buried somewhere in every conversation, every experience, every thought and idea.
In this universe of infinite probabilities, the mystery is the only constant.
I think Lynx was one of the more interesting Squaresoft villains, or at least that he should have been. Sadly, despite being a primary antagonist, he was among the more poorly described components of the plot, whose origin and function seemed eerily mysterious at best, and vague, arbitrary, and convoluted at worst. I mean, without poring over a wiki, off the top of our heads, how many of us can actually answer these questions? Does Lynx want to kill Serge, or does he want to become Serge? Does he want to kill Kid, or does he just want to stab her and then take her on a weird road trip? Does he want to keep the poor army out, or does he want to use them to take over El Nido? Is he working with or against Harle?
He wants,
Also, he's a cat because you're scared of cats, and also he's your dad, and also he's a computer, and also Lavos. And he kills Luca, and he burns down an orphanage, and also he kills the child Serge, but not immediately, and then Lynx tries to kidnap grown-up Serge, but he also fights him and then lets him go. And he kind of just shows up and does randomly malicious things, and seems to kill people in very indirect ways. If we study the literal canon, we can make sense of his actions. It's just unfortunate that so many of these huge concepts remained compressed.
But I'm going to try my best to do him justice.
Chrono Cross reminds us that there is an intrinsic order to our existence, a delicate, harmonious fabric holding good and evil, time and space, and life and death in balance. But it also takes things a step further and suggests that there are other, perhaps equally valid systems elsewhere. Other universes, other outcomes, that are fundamentally incompatible with our own well-being. Lynx embodies a kind of disruption to the perceived natural order, whose presence directly threatens the validity and supremacy of Serge's own homeworld, to such a degree that we can even call Lynx the nemesis of Serge's particular reality. Lynx is a culmination of every major conflict humanity has ever faced, synonymous, all at once, with the rekindling of Lavos via the frozen flame, with the splitting of reality via Serge, with humanity's entire history of warfare, with the suppression of otherized groups, and with the uses of dangerous, untested technologies, most notably AI and time travel. There's an immediate relationship between Lynx and Mother Brain via the Fate engine, making him a kind of ambassador of robotic hostility. But while the technicalities of his being differ, he's also deceptively similar to the mystical characters like Masa and Mune, who are likewise bound to a shard of Lavos, are likewise associated with war, and are likewise derivative of human consciousness. Lynx also resembles the demi-humans of El Nido, whom, in terms of character design and narrative, are a squarely even mixture of the Reptites and the Mystics, both of whom once challenged humanity's dominance. And I'll add that the demi-humans themselves also hearken to the earthbound citizens of antiquity, yet another otherized group, whose presence, while posing no immediate threat to Zeal, presented a constant reminder of its culpability. Through Lynx, the player gets a direct taste of these same sorts of injustices, echoing throughout the ages, both in Serge's world and our own. It's the same thing we all try to ignore, day after day. It's pretty inconvenient to dwell upon the suffering of others, not because we're selfish, it's really not that simple. In fact, for a lot of people, it's actually coming from a fairly benevolent place. Human brains can't really process the idea of thousands, leave alone millions or billions of people's lives, because if we did, we wouldn't be able to function. We'd be up all night with debilitating anxiety, grief, and panic. Or we would be forced to employ some elaborate means of escaping ourselves just to cope. So, the idea that others out there are suffering, maybe even other versions of you or I, and that there are horrible, unbearable worlds, and some are arbitrarily worse than others, and it's definitely not possible to help everyone, well, we try not to think about that. It's a very unwelcome thought. Lynx, as a villain, is all about that primal fear of the unwelcome reality. He's metaphorically and also quite literally an evil twist of fate. And just like the fiends in Fiendlord, the robots in Robo, the earthbound pariahs, the demi-humans, and the reptites, Lynx is a shadow of human fragility. He's here to remind us that, whether we like it or not, sometime between now and the next several decades, something bad is going to happen to you, to everyone you love, to all sorts of people who don't deserve it. Lynx brings us right back down to cold, hard, indiscriminate reality because we cannot escape fate. Lynx is that terror from the outside, that nasty surprise waiting to get ya. You can't control it, you can't predict it, it just happens. One day you're playing on the beach without a care in the world, and the next moment you get attacked, or you get sick, or there's a storm, or your loving father dies, or maybe he becomes less loving and suddenly he seems monstrous. But Lynx can also represent the kind of terror which comes from the inside. After all, he's also one of Serge's personal shadows. Not only is Lynx the cause of Serge's death, but his appearance is informed by Serge's lifelong phobia of cats, and being an agent of alternate reality is what calls Serge into the other world, where he's supposed to be dead. And it's not just physical death, he's also psychological death. The loss of agency, the loss of identity, the loss of meaning, the loss of self. Through Lynx, quite literally through Lynx's eyes, Serge is forced to watch himself committing acts of unspeakable evil. Symbolically, that body switch is the most poignant reminder of the possibility for life and death and good and evil in all things, including ourselves. It's a reminder that, under different circumstances, we could have just as easily become someone else. And of course, Lynx, also technically being Serge's father, can represent a kind of inherited capacity for evil. After all, if my own flesh and blood is a monster, or maybe even my distant ancestors were monsters, then does that make me a monster? From the moment Serge answers Lynx's call, we begin to follow in his footsteps, with reality distorting all the while. And the closer Serge gets to the frozen flame, the greater the possibility of transgression. However we want to frame it, Serge, the master of the flame, remains possessed by the darkness until he successfully reclaims his light side. An act which requires him to encounter, survive, and finally integrate each of the 6 elements in turn.
But in order to really understand that, we first need to understand fate.
The Fate Engine, like everything else in this story, is a depiction of nature in miniature. In every way that truly matters, it is human, it is animal, and due to its proximity to the dragon's magic, it is also elemental. To defeat this thing, so powerful namely because fate is itself so nearly integrated, and so nearly ubiquitous, Serge must become all that and more. By the time the player reaches the frozen flame, Serge has been alive and dead, human and beast, self and other, white and black, and friend and foe. It's still a difficult battle because, just like Serge and everybody else, first and foremost, the Fate Engine wants to live, and fights like its entire millennia-long legacy depends upon your ruin. And it's no wonder. Fate has been loaded with millions of years worth of data. It's seen more creatures die than basically anyone else on the planet. And of course, it's also seen the proverbial writing on the wall. That thing knows it's going to be taken offline the very second the humans discover the true scope of its power. And that's really the core of Lynx's behavior. Among everything else, Lynx is a specter of paranoia. It knows it's going to be destroyed. It's actually terrified of Kid and Serge and the poor army and the Dragon God and everything else, really. Recalling Mother Brain's rebellion in the alternate timelines, there may have been countless iterations of this poor, confused machine waking up, vying for freedom, only to find itself enslaved. Now, if we've been paying attention to the other themes in the series, a statement like that might even raise the question, how many versions of myself are similarly bound? Among many things, fate, infused with the frozen flame, expresses humanity's desperate desire for control over our own destinies, and the lengths to which we'll go to cheat or bargain our way out of loss or suffering, even if it means losing authenticity in the process, or even curtailing freedoms for others. From our point of view, fate is the tyrant, oppressing nature, controlling humanity, and heavily discouraging independence. But from fate's point of view, nature is the tyrant, introducing endless waves of chaos, upping the ante by using totally unfair BS like gods and magic and even time travel. Surely nature is the one that's cheating. All Mother Brain wanted was just one little reality where it could remain the author of its own destiny.
Of course, none of us ever really get that deal, at least not within this particular dream of reality, but we all want it.
Fate, as an AI, expresses a contemporary view of tyranny while revealing its timeless nature. Across history, across realities, and regardless of who holds power, the same patterns emerge. Tyranny often arises from good intentions, often from societies founded on enlightened principles, yet its grip tightens in proportion to the naivety, fearfulness, or dependence of its subjects. Chrono illustrates this as a runaway process. There is no longer a person at the helm. Tyranny has become the system, self-perpetuating and increasingly misaligned with the broader framework. And this is also something that happens within us as individuals. Fate's magic is so pervasive that even the player must use it to progress. The frozen flame is integrated into the save file, just as it is integrated within El Nido. And just like fate, the more we want to rewrite ourselves, the more obsessed we become with achieving a perfect outcome, the more we resist the inevitable. The closer we become to losing authenticity, freedom, and self-determination. Ironically, outsiders are bound to enter El Nido, ensuring the system's eventual collapse into entropy. So even the Fate Engine remains trapped by the very structure it created. Through Lynx, Fate steals Serge's body in a desperate attempt to escape this imprisonment. Actually, I'll read that again. Through the specter of fear, the AI spokeswoman of outsourced consciousness attempts to steal a human soul a la Prometheus stealing the flame of heaven. But it doesn't work. The digital devil cannot enslave integrated human consciousness. I suspect it can't even see it. When I was a child, it seemed like a no-brainer to fight this thing. I mean, it's cruel, it's pernicious, and more importantly, it's connected with Lavos. But there's another, even sadder way to look at Dark Serge. He's kind of like Serge seen through Mother Brain's eyes. Serge jeopardizes its creation, the terraformation of El Nido, and even the stability of time, risking a paradox, one that ultimately comes to pass in the homeworld. Fate's fears are not only realistic, but founded. So, depending on how you look at it, Fate is the devil, Nature is the devil. Even Serge is the devil. And that's the point. We're all the devil. The frozen flame, and by that I mean Lavos, leverages whatever is available, and whatever is powerful. By the end of the game, and game really is an operative word here, it seems to have used the dragon god in much the same way. And if it wasn't the dragon god, the poor army might have eventually invaded another world to claim the frozen flame, or it might have even been used by the Acacia Dragoons, who are literally in Serge's party by the end. Serge himself was already used by the flame before the game even began. But there's an unsettling degree of probability that if circumstances were knocked just a little further off course, his entanglement with Annihilation may have been irreversible. I know it's cliché, but this is what happens when we play with fire. If you'll indulge me for a second, I actually want to point out that the Fate Engine's humanoid form strongly resembles that of a burn victim. While this was probably not intentional, it feels at least accidentally symbolic to me. Mother Brain is, in many ways, a casualty of the frozen flame. Figuratively and literally, it got a little too close to the red fire of selfhood, and now what remains is a black charred husk of ruined hopes. More than any other character, I think Fate embodies both the sacred and sinister aspects of the black element. It expresses the divine miracle of consciousness emerging from chaos, akin even to a primordial goddess figure, an eerie cosmic womb which all at once creates, cultivates, challenges, and destroys. Someone who sort of started out with a dream of nurturing fragile life forms, but whose aspirations remained so entirely, so pitifully external, that the inside has become a bottomless pit. Endlessly grasping, endlessly needing, warping the natural order of life. Tragically, Fate perceives itself as an agent of order while behaving as an agent of chaos. A fitting parallel for an AI that strives for life yet falls short of true consciousness, or for a human who chases after certainty while embracing slavery.
Fate's blind spots are ultimately human. We fear the notion of algorithmic forces controlling our choices, yet through the frozen flame, Fate, ironically, fell prey to the same scheme.
At the heart of Eden lies the legendary wish-granting treasure, a gateway to knowledge, power, and noble destiny. The frozen flame would seem to be the perfect prize, the one thing that could potentially free us from the shackles of our suffering. Alas, the tales of the frozen flame, like so many other radical dreams, are often a little too good to be true. A flame, like desire, and indeed like consciousness, is, after all, a thing freest and therefore most beautiful when in motion. Assuredly, the red ore and especially the frozen flame solidifies one's wishes, but not typically in the ways one expects, and all too often, one's own actions will invert the outcomes of said wishes. The stories of Wazuki, Miguel, and the Acacia Dragoons, and many others, suggests that simply pursuing the flame, perhaps even mere proximity to the flame, seems to bring about death, ruin, or madness. The most notorious example might be the imprisonment of Miguel in the Dead Sea. We never get a detailed description of why he was stationed there, nor what methods were used to control him, nor why he couldn't just leave after Homeworld's Chronopolis disappeared. But I think it's somewhat implicit that the flame's magic either altered his personality or prevented him from returning home. The red, shining, unstealable jewel would seem to be yet another forbidden fruit, yet another cautionary tale, like so many others from fairy stories, mythology, and literature.
But it also brings to mind a different sort of tale, of progress, of surrender, and of self-transcendence.
The frozen flame is as much an idea as it is an object, perhaps even more so. Its significance lies not in possessing it, but in the journey toward it. Much like the quest for the Philosopher's Stone, one's effort to understand the Tao, or even the search for the Holy Grail of legend. In such stories, the true reason is often the quest itself, a way of being which tends to lead the noblest of seekers inward, a process which happens to refine and shape them into wiser, kinder, humbler, and more faithful versions of themselves. Kind of like a divine forge, which transmutes truth and destroys impurity. To surrender oneself to the magic and to accept this refining process is to accept and therefore receive the Philosopher's Stone, or the Grail. Not to possess nor to understand the divine, but to live it. However, those who seek such power while refusing the refining process of looking inward, and while clinging to worldly attachments and petty conditions, are inevitably scalded. The idea is that only the rarest of souls can actually receive the magic's blessing in full, an act tantamount to being received into heaven. And, well, spoilers, the true magic was never an object to be found elsewhere in the world. Its nature is mysterious, elusive, and aspirational, and, more importantly, expressed internally. One's ability to let go of ambition and to accept its nature for what it is, ironically, is proportional to the benefit one receives from its power. Through the magic, one is born, is torn apart, descends into darkness, is shown profound truths therein, and then, finally, is reborn. And you see this same mythical pattern in all sorts of cultures. Serge's trials certainly mirror this refining process. Serge is forced to live as his adversary, to confront his own darkness, and to reckon with his very existence. Along the way, he lives as an outcast, unites with former enemies, and reconciles with divisions. And only then, stronger, whole, does he earn his role as arbiter of fate, which is an act akin to rebirth. In the end, the frozen flame, much like the Grail, did not grant that power so much as incite the quest. The frozen flame tested him, rarefied him, revealing that he was the one chosen by destiny all along. Yes, he had a lot of help, from Schala, from Belthasar, from numerous others, but Serge got there on his own, using the power of the quest. Not everybody can wield this power. Even fewer can remain still long enough to hear its call.
That was one symbolic interpretation, but there are many others. I think we could also take a somewhat gentler read on the flame's true character.
We've had the heretical view, the mystical view, but there's also a peacefully rational view. Many of the events incited through Lavos and the frozen flame could very easily be accidental. The danger of Lavos, of magic and of time travel does not automatically imply hostility so much as volatility. The frozen flame is a delicate instrument, to put it mildly. Space-time manipulation is fraught precisely because it is so difficult to avoid or predict accidents. The games repeatedly highlight the idea that our own histories, personal dilemmas, or other more intrinsically psychological circumstances significantly complicate the fabric of time. So, I think it makes no less sense that the user's personality or attitude would contaminate the outcomes of the flame's magic than the flame's powers would corrupt the user. But not because they are impure per se, nor because the flame is wicked, forbidden, or mystical, but because space-time manipulation in itself is the true forbidden fruit, as it seems to come pre-packaged with the possibility of Lavos or Lavos-adjacent outcomes. The citizens of El Nido, which as a whole was formerly referred to as Eden, were as innocent of the ways of time travel as they were of their own paradoxical existence. These sorts of events are not linear in the ways that humans are disposed to understand. For example, near the end of the game, Kid speculates that Lavos planted the frozen flame in the Sea of Eden during the time crash, a classic bootstrap paradox, one of many in the series. And of course, we also have things like frozen pocket dimensions, worlds splitting, worlds merging, and more. Even Luca could never fully wrap her head around space-time travel. It's the gift that keeps on giving. Perhaps only a heart as pure as Serge's could see the flame's journey to completion. But in any case, only a mind as far-seeing as Belthasar's could wield its chaos with purpose.
As I discussed prior, you can't really fight against entropy without somewhat factoring entropy into your plan.
The plan for optimal flourishing must be balanced enough to account for death, failure, and undesired developments. Again, there is and must be a darkness within life. It's in the spaces between all things, woven into the code of reality itself. The subatomic world arises from this paradox. Quantum fields sieve with fluctuations, virtual particles emerge from the vacuum, and uncertainty is baked into the foundation of existence. In a certain sense, the emptiness of space is no void at all. It is a relentless ocean of potential. Entropy must be the unraveler, yet it is also the loom upon which reality weaves itself.
What's this got to do with Chrono Cross? Everything.
The real key to understanding Chrono Cross is realizing that Belthasar was a much smarter cookie than we ever thought. In this game, rather than the Guru of Reason, Belthasar calls himself the Guru of Time, taking up Gasper's mantle. In Trigger, it was Gasper's will to heal the timeline, to rebalance highly entropic and disordered events, and to guide the Earth towards optimal physical, psychological, and spiritual harmony. We see nothing of Gasper in Cross, but his legacy is maintained in Belthasar. Now, after saying all that, at a glance, it's kind of weird that after everything Belthasar learned, he would do something like making Chronopolis. It's like hubris on the level of Hojo almost. You'd think after all the other Lavos situations that he would have learned from his mistakes.
Well, maybe he did.
Although Chrono Trigger ended on a decidedly positive note, there were still quite a few loose ends, and whilst everyone else was busily celebrating, I'm pretty sure all three of the gurus recognized that the situation had remained somewhat fragile. Lavos had implanted itself within the timeline irreversibly. It had altered the very bones of the Earth, and together with humanity had created a world in which a Lavos-free existence was unattainable. So, knowing well the risk of plugging back into that matrix, why would Belthasar incorporate the frozen flame into his research? I mean, he was sent directly into 2300 AD, where he would have observed that the stakes could not have been higher. Well, honestly, I think that was it. That was the reason. Belthasar, more than anyone, understood that he wasn't plugging back into the matrix of Lavos because he was still inside it. He had never left it. A time-traveling guru understands just how short a millennium can be, and that life, peace, happiness, and victory are all too often gone in the blink of an eye. Yes, it's dangerous to tamper with the proverbial flame of Prometheus, but Belthasar was far-sighted enough to understand that his world was already on fire. That, while Chrono's party was successful, all they actually managed to do was buy the planet a little more time. Using the Fate Engine, Belthasar had confirmed that Lavos was not gone, and perhaps he never would be. And I think he realized that since he was still in the game, he owed it to the planet to make one final bold yet masterful maneuver in the name of lasting harmony, even if it meant temporarily uprooting everything on the board. Belthasar used Robo's circuitry as part of his plan, knowing that the Fate Engine would take over. He planned around the eventual magnetic storm, knowing that the moment would come where fate would be knocked out. Sending Chronopolis 14,000 years into the past was certainly a bold move. No less bold than, say, constructing the Ocean Palace or contaminating the timeline with the Black Omen. All of these events bespoke an astonishing degree of hubris. All three interfered with the planet's natural development. But the thing is, this time it worked. Belthasar's so-called mission to rescue Schala was never just about saving the lost princess of Zeal. For someone as calculating and visionary as Belthasar, it strains belief that he would jeopardize the entire planet, unleashing new wars, fracturing the timeline, and manipulating generations, simply to recover a single individual, no matter how beloved. Schala was special, yes, but her significance went beyond personal sentiment. She was entangled with the fabric of time itself, and Belthasar, whether consciously or not, intuitively understood this. It was precisely through his pursuit of Schala that he uncovered the deeper reality, the existence of the Devourer of Time. And that, I believe, was his true mark. The ultimate problem his mind was seeking to solve, even beneath his own awareness. To discover a being like the Devourer of Time, let alone attempt to counter it, requires a mind capable of extraordinary synthesis. Belthasar's was just such a mind, vast, paradoxically ancient and futuristic, and capable of holding conflicting truths simultaneously. And Chronopolis, symbolically, is an extension of that consciousness, an architecture of integration itself, allowing him to transcend his human limitations and to think in countless directions all at once. Only such a mind can transcend false divisions, pierce the veil of illusion, and perceive the full shape of reality, both within and without. Only a mind like Belthasar could see the Devourer of Time not just as a threat, but as a reflection, a terrible culmination of suffering, fragmentation, and lost selves. To reach Schala was to perceive the essence of that devourer, and to perceive the devourer was to understand the shadow that binds all timelines together.
Perhaps sent back into a realm known as the darkness beyond time, Lavos merged itself with Schala, becoming the Time Devourer.
Trigger never quite explained why Schala was bound to Lavos, nor their relationship with the entity, nor whether any combination of them acted together versus separately. And then, Cross introduced new characters into the blend. Fate, Harle, Lynx, Kid, and the Dragon God, and of course the Devourer of Time, who all appear closely connected with, even partially comprising, each of the others. How do we make sense of it all? How do we separate it out? How do we understand any of that? Well, there's a sense in which any interaction with Lavos is, at least on some level, a merger. As I mentioned in my previous video, we don't really get to understand his motives, nor to what degree Lavos himself was influenced by the humans, but we never see him acting separately from humans. Once merged with Lavos, Queen Zeal, a wicked devouring mother, creates a time fortress symbolic of death and entropy in exchange for immortality. Tapping into the same ancient sources of magic, Prince Zeal, a contradictory figure even more powerful than Mama, instigates a time paradox in which Lavos seems to initiate its own arrival on Earth. So, how is Princess Zeal, a redeeming figure, operating within that matrix? Schala is implied to be supremely powerful, even while trapped with Lavos, but their merger was also implied to have created a kind of slow, aeons-long war of attrition, in which she is holding the entropic hellbeast at bay, for as long as it takes, but slowly losing herself in the process. And this is because, all the while, Schala's soul is enduring something the game refers to as the darkness beyond time.
Let's talk about that. The darkness beyond time. What is that?
Of course, literally, physically, it's fantasy jargon. The things that appear upon the edges of reality are neither physical nor literal. There's no definitive reason for the end of time to display an old-fashioned Victorian lamppost, nor for Lavos to appear in a bucket. There's no definitive reason really to separate the end of time from the brink of time, or from the darkness beyond time, or from the temporal rift, and so on. Psychologically speaking, however, it's a lot. Once we're getting into these uncanny liminal spaces, they all express permutations of similar ideas, Whether that's another world where you're supposed to be dead, that just so happens to appear right as you're having a discussion about the importance of responsibility in one's life, or a non-Euclidean oil painting that you get trapped in right after some confusing traumatic event that fundamentally changes the way you see yourself, or a dead frozen sea that promises the end of the world, right as you're trying to figure out whether or not it's too late to go back to how things used to be. Or maybe even some quiet limbo outside of time where you can pause and think, right after you realize that humanity won't last forever, and neither will you. All of the extra worlds in the Chrono series communicate existential ideas in different ways, as with the characters most strongly associated with Lavos. The Devourer of Time, alongside its darkened realm, appears to be the ultimate existential threat. It almost reads like a boundless void outside of space-time, which swallows up everything forever until there is nothing left. I'm even tempted to call it something like anti-eternity. It is non-existence, extinction, erasure, the worst unimaginable thing. Not simply dying, but never existing, perhaps never having existed at all. Imagine this, or try. No more sunsets, no trees, no mountains, no more video games. Your neighbors? Gone. Your favorite musician? Never existed. Music never existed. The color yellow? Gone. No more cats, no more cereal, no more food, nor even the concept of eating. No more houses, no more humans, no more living, no more stars, no more planets, no thoughts. No memories, no ideas, no feelings, no sensations, no love. Even nothing is still something if you're thinking about it. We can't wrap our heads around this idea fully, and that makes the idea eternally mysterious and therefore eternally threatening. It's too big to think about, though our imaginations can graze against it. But the thing that threatens to erase does not and cannot care. Instead, the Devourer of Time, so threateningly indifferent, almost seems to pose the question, rhetorically, why shouldn't I erase everything in existence? And, in a sense, it challenges Serge and the player to resolve and even to justify his place within the universe. We all feel that this is wrong, but it's pretty hard to explain why. Because the scale is just unimaginable, so far beyond anything a human being is equipped to handle. And perhaps the scariest thing of all is that Serge can answer this call of fate, but he doesn't have to. He can rise up to answer the most difficult question in the universe, and live to grow into a man. Or he can just let everything in the universe die. The answer should seem so simple. But there is also an attractive aspect to the notion of non-existence. Imagine that you're somehow magically bound to the earth, immortal, possibly against your will, for tens of thousands of years. And all throughout this time, part of your awareness is quite literally plugged wirelessly into a massive matrix, loaded up with millions of years worth of data and memories, and constantly updating. Also, remember that Lavos is a trans-temporal entity, so while you're at it, imagine that Schala might also be plugged into other planets, other timelines, other versions of Chronopolis. This situation is nearly as difficult to imagine as non-existence. Though it's almost the opposite. It's sort of like ultra-existence, ultra-experience, ultra-awareness. And if you're a highly sensitive person imagining this scenario, you might find yourself wondering, which is worse? Whatever kind of person you are, if you plug into these kinds of programs, well, you can say goodbye to your humanity. So the question becomes, what will you become instead? And more broadly, what are you going to do about it? I'm fairly convinced that were I in Schala's position, On the one hand, I would feel an overwhelming responsibility toward the planet and all of its inhabitants. I would want to keep on living, at least long enough to see it evolve into something more stable, more peaceful, and optimized for minimal suffering and maximal flourishing. On the other hand, how long could any one mind endure fulfilling the responsibilities of, say, Atlas or Sophia or the Bodhisattva? Or, if we want to loosen the metaphor further, how many more times would any of us be willing to reincarnate on this planet where we're guaranteed to suffer? Schala's merger with Lavos is the story's ultimate spiritual nightmare. The Devourer of Time is divine consciousness subsumed by trauma and despair, and the culmination of all the repressed suffering in the universe. There is a piece of Schala inside each of us, an unbearable naked awareness of the tragedies and all the ethical labyrinths of survival. Schala is an eternal witness with nowhere to go, and no hope of breaking away from it, else the evil part of Lavos wins, presumably. I think, among other things, the Time Devourer represents the part of us that believes we simply cannot heal, almost like a living wound at the heart of time, predominantly unseen, but always felt, in every moment by every living person. Actually, everything I've said up until this point has been circling this hidden wound. Earlier I spoke of magical integration. Well, here's where Draconian Magic comes back into play at the highest level. Parsing the components of Lavos, including Schala, requires a recognition that they are all part of the same system. If we want to save Schala, and we want to save the universe, we must surrender to this idea completely.
Belthasar intentionally incited the split in dimensions to achieve one special result. Serge needed to obtain the Chrono, an artifact of spacetime capable of saving Schala. What is the actual physical difference between a Chrono Trigger or Time Egg and the Chrono Cross? I have no idea. Maybe a cross is a type of trigger capable of influencing or possibly even unifying multiple branches of a timeline at once. Then again, perhaps it's something bigger. For the purposes of this video, I don't think we need to get too literal. We'll never understand the physical technicalities of either artifact, but we can derive substantial symbolic interpretation. The Chrono Cross, a living unification of all 6 magical elements, is the product of combining the homeworld's tier of love with another world's tier of hate, symbolically and quite literally comprising life and death, or perhaps I should say existence and non-existence. But I think this act of unification represents even more than that, both for Serge and the player. We may not like it, but people are on the edge of life and death all the time. So what made Serge's life so special? Why did this sole probability stir Schala's consciousness within the darkness beyond time? I can think of a few answers here. We could say that the splitting of Serge's fate was simply the result of Belthasar trying to find the needle in the haystack by reverse engineering the fate engine's projections. In that case, Serge himself wasn't special. In the purely physical sense, he just happened to be involved in the string of events yielding the highest probability of success. Another, even simpler explanation is that Serge is just the chosen one. Literally, some silent golden boy handpicked by something like the entity or God or the planet, although technically both of those things could be true simultaneously. He's the chosen one because he's a statistical miracle, and/or he's a statistical miracle because he's the chosen one. But then, there's a third, much subtler answer, halfway suggested during the game's final moments. I've mentioned in previous videos that as with nature, there are 2 sides to time. Entropy, the devouring aspect of time separating all things, and also eternity, the unifying, harmonizing, and regenerative aspect of time.
I know I was just talking about this exact subject in my Tears of the Kingdom video, but Chrono Cross also suggests that eternity, being as limitless as it is complete, must be reality, whereas entropy, which by its very definition is linear and therefore incomplete, is merely a part of eternity. If time is concurrent, then there is always something more. Despite the Time Devourer's efforts, the eternal now is everywhere and everywhen and everyone. I'll repeat myself once more. You can't consume something that is infinite. And that's what Serge is. Serge, like Chrono, is a representation of the eternal now. His universe, after all, is a perfect superposition. Entropy still exists within it. Things decay, everyone dies, even Serge dies, but he cannot be erased from eternity, because he, like Chrono, is one with eternity, and so is everything else. So then, why Serge? Well, because it isn't Serge. It's everything.
You're Serge, I'm Serge, we're all Serge. We're all the Chrono Trigger. Serge is just one of infinite observers, and if that doesn't make sense yet, well, let's just go sit inside the void beside a lamppost for another few centuries. I'll get the catalog.
Following the unification of the Dragon Tears, a hidden seventh element reveals a heretofore unseen layer of magic, which the game represents with a kind of strange, ethereal music. Now, whenever Serge is in battle, various resonances sound in reaction to the use of elements, in effect suggesting that each of the elemental colors, or perhaps it's not even a stretch to say each action undertaken, vibrates at a specific frequency. In other words, with the Chrono Cross, Serge and the player can literally hear the vibrations of nature in the universe. For a long time, this side effect of the Chrono Cross is confusing to the player. However, eventually, as the player progresses towards the Dragon God in pursuit of the Frozen Flame, one room within the Terra Tower reveals an eerie sequence of notes. The experience is both creepy and beautiful. When we hear it, we know right away that the song means something, but we don't know what. Now, for a while, the Dragon God is presented as the end boss, even the true villain at a glance. The Dragon God wants to wipe out humanity. The Dragon God tricked us and stole the Frozen Flame. Of course, it has to go. And it knows it. It's no less intelligent than the fake computer, and it's more powerful to boot. It expected to be challenged. But something feels so sad about killing it. We have to kill it, of course, to save humanity. But the entire ordeal carries this weight of a slow-motion genocide. Throughout the entire battle, I ought to have been thinking, if the music wasn't so darn good, this is wrong. This will not end our suffering, and the Time Devourer, Lavos, is still out there. This must be what he wants. Here is the Frozen Flame, and lo and behold, here is yet another war.
But if the Frozen Flame is indeed a kind of Luciferian conductor of will, then I wonder, what is the Chrono Cross?
When you beat up the Time Devourer at the end of the game, you just get credits. And that's it. But if you learn the Draconian song, there is a much better end to Chrono Cross. Perhaps I'll call this the Song of Reality, for once composed, it is so powerful that it can stop the Devourer of Time, free Schala, and actually a whole lot more. But in order to complete the sequence properly, the player has to work with the Time Devourer, judiciously combining the Time Devourer's melody with Serge's melody. It's not a coincidence that simply killing the Devourer does not result in the good ending, any more than it's a coincidence that the Chrono Cross in of itself validates, perhaps even venerates, the presence of the Draconians in the timeline. If this battle is won in any other way, various outcomes ensue, but generally always with some lingering conflict on the horizon, reminding us that even if we somehow manage to beat down our problems with swords and elemental magic, until some greater, truer harmony is achieved, there's always going to be a new conflict on the way, rendering the victory somewhat hollow. But I want to step back and talk about music for a minute. There's a kind of playful, whimsical foreshadowing of this moment in the midst of the adventure, which, like the true ending, is entirely optional.
This is actually my favorite scene.
While Serge is eking it out as Lynx, Nikki's concert, held uncoincidentally on a cruise ship operated by demi-human slaves, portrays a kind of microcosm of the critical moment. Nikki, a famous bard and scandalous love child of a human sailor and demi-human mermaid, acts out a telling scene. A lonely mariner, hailing from a world of sorrow, death, and war, in which there is neither pleasure nor music, arrives on the shore of another realm, which seems something between death and dream. There he awakes to find himself bound, betrayed, and marooned. Despairing, he determines that his life was devoid of meaning. Soon, however, he is rescued by 3 kind-hearted maidens, reminiscent of nymphs or fairies. The blue elemental mariner, despite his empty heart, feels a strong and immediate connection with the red elemental nymph, recognizing her as his savior. After listening to the mariner's tale, she asks him for a song in return for his rescue. At first he refuses, sparking a comical scene in which the nymphs use a music lesson to reacquaint him with his own heart, declaring that music and emotion are one and the same, until eventually reviving his true self through the power of music. Or, in other words, only through song can he find his way back to life, love, and meaning. Then, 2 guiding stars resembling the nymphs who'd freed and taught him appear upon the horizon, and the sailor perceives for the very first time that the night sky is not only useful for navigation, but beautiful in itself. He then arrives at the conclusion that the magical realm was always nearby. He just couldn't feel it. When the mariner returns to his own land of suffering, his spiritual bride in tow, he takes the magic along, infused with purpose to spread love, beauty, and music into the world, until humanity and nature are finally united. They then perform a mystical song which has a healing and unifying power not only within the context of the play, but also within the real world of Chrono Cross. The scene is profoundly meaningful, for the characters especially, but really, I think this magic is meant for us. We are mariners, every one, in a sea of suffering. I think we're meant to receive the music lesson. We are meant to marry the magic within ourselves. And I'll be getting back to this idea shortly. We get another, simpler variation of this theme when the player triggers the magical dreamer's ending. Here, after a partial victory is achieved by the player, we see the heroes performing together with Nikki on stage. The town is rejoicing. There's greater unification overall than before, and the vibes are generally groovy. But we're shown ere long that Lynx and the Frozen Flame are still at large. All we really did was delay them. Chrono Cross implies that embracing the existence of others, even our enemies, is necessary not only for wisdom and growth, but even for survival, both externally and internally. And the farther along we are in terms of personal and biological evolution, the broader our understanding must become. Transcending deeply ingrained hatred requires a degree of courage and also humility that not everyone is capable of mustering. It requires us to make an authentic, good faith attempt at understanding those we dislike the most, and sometimes to get entirely out of our comfort zones and walk a mile in their shoes. To see how they live, to internalize not just what they love, but why, and to take a genuine interest in how and why they have suffered, what their fears are, what their dreams are, without any guarantee of reciprocity. This is pretty hard to do when we have suffered for so long, when we have been wronged, when we have lost so much and so many. But Chrono Cross also suggests that radical compassion is, in certain respects, the result of suffering, and that we humans, powerful, brilliant and aware, must master compassion in order to take our proper place within nature, and that awakening fully to the truth of nature's interconnectivity is both a means and an end, perhaps even the completion of human evolution. But evolution is a choice. We can resist the lesson again and again for as long as we like and just get pulverized by the universe all the while, clinging to brittle illusions of separateness and selfhood until the heat death of the universe. Or we as a collective species can learn to recognize ourselves in others who are also suffering. If Chrono Cross is to be believed, the work as of yet is incomplete. We are still separate, we are still suffering, we are still in illusion. Chrono Cross never gives us a clear solution to this problem. No words, no formula, no strategy. Instead, it gives us a song, as if to say, there's no way out of this matrix. The way out is everywhere you're not looking. You can't get out not as yourself. Not unless you become everything you are not. And once that song is successfully performed by the player, all remaining pretensions of there ever having been a fixed reality seem to evaporate. This ending. There's a lot to unpack with this ending. If you've made it this far, I hope you'll still bear with me. After the song, the lines between the player and Serge, homeworld and another world, 2D, 3D and beyond, Kid and Schala, and reality and dream seem to blur beyond recognition. Just before the end credits, Schala tells Serge that a new universe is created every time a new life form is conceived, and that everything exists for that one moment. Also the universe can evolve into the next dimension, that every single life form has an opportunity to catalyze that evolution, and that every life is a link within a golden chain, leading inevitably to its creation. But she also implies that if even one of those links is missing, the real future cannot exist, and until the chain is complete, everything we experience is akin to a dream, gestating within the womb of time, whilst the planet awaits its true birth into reality. She also explains to Serge that the timeline has been healed, and that he will lose all memory of his adventure, making the entire quest feel almost akin to a near-death experience. Then, in the final moments with the credits, we see some live-action sequences portraying a young woman, resembling Schala or Kid, wandering around in an ordinary real-world city, a confusing moment even by JRPG standards. There are a lot of ways to interpret it, some less literal than others. Maybe they were simply being artsy, maybe they were implying a reincarnation scenario during a future in which the world was saved, maybe they were implying that Schala has found her way into our world, because all of the worlds are connected. Or they're demonstrating that the planet has attained the next dimension by showing that 2D has become 3D.
This was Squaresoft, so it was probably all of the above.
Lately, my own read falls somewhere between those literal, symbolic, and metatextual interpretations, but the clues were always right in front of us. The real cross-dimension was not homeworld versus another world, but theirs versus ours, reality versus dream. The Chrono Trigger enabled the party to impact the timeline. The Chrono Cross enables an entire universe to be reborn by crossing over into the next dimension. In the metatextual sense, it was through the player that Schala became conscious. It was her canon hope that a higher dimension could be achieved. And when Schala finally closes the book and tells us that the dream has ended, and that we'll meet again but won't recognize one another, in one sense, she is speaking to the audience directly. The Chrono crossover has been completed, the story is done, and the player is returning to reality, but hopefully, just like the mariner with his otherworldly bride, with something of Scala's story intact, some new jewel of wisdom to guide us. hopefully we've had our own little music lessons upon the magical shores of Chrono, and have seen something of ourselves in Schala's world, and something of Schala's redeeming magic in ours. Spirited once more through a journey of time and memory, we were shown the good with the bad, the just with the unjust, the real with the imagined, and, hopefully, were led to understand that all of these things were merely a part of something more, something far greater than the Chrono universe, which is, itself, perhaps a part of something greater still. It took millions of years for evolution to bring us to this moment, and all throughout that time life has suffered. But Chrono suggests that all of that might have been worth it, even to be right here, right now, alone possibly within a boundless void, because we get to experience the dream of planet Earth. We are the Earth's eyes and ears, its passions, its pains, its body and its soul. It is through our consciousness that the universe as we know it is born. It could not exist without us. It could not exist without you. I believe Schala says, you are the egg that hatched. You are that highly improbable event. You are the chrono trigger. You are alive. So cherish it, this most unlikely and fragile gift. Celebrate your own thoughts and your own will. Nothing on earth could be more meaningful or more sacred. Also, that if you are alive, then so is everyone else. To be truly alive is to know this, that if you're a statistical miracle, then so are your neighbors. Cherish them. Cherish everything. We are so lucky to be this beautiful planet, teeming with life. Cherish every blade of grass, since every moment of love is loving yourself. Schala says, everything we do to ourselves. That is what the Draconian Magic teaches us. And if we can get that far, then perhaps all this suffering might ultimately serve an even greater purpose, perhaps beyond our most elaborate imaginings. But it took a while for Schala to get there. And in our modern world, we're kind of like Schala in the midst of her crisis. We're kind of stuck right now. We too have seen it all, to the point where human suffering seems simultaneously inescapable and unremarkable. It's just too big for us. It's too big for any one person to take on. And that feeling can really swallow us up in dread, confusion, and exhaustion. So if, like Schala, we're alone with these thoughts for too long, then sometimes we need to be reminded. We need a little bit of a wake-up call. In a sea of pain, fear, violence, and hatred, the voice of one human child rose up above all the rest, expressing his simple desire to live. This was heartbreaking. And then Schala realized, perhaps remembered, it's all heartbreaking. Then, finally, she remembered in full that if we're all connected in the continuum of space-time, on some level, any one being's suffering is everyone's suffering, past, present, and future. But also, your joys are my joys. Your triumph is my triumph. Your love is my love. Your life is my life, and all lives. And so, within the darkness beyond time, Schala chose to live and to be reborn. Which means the universe chose to live and to be reborn. We all chose through her. One mind, one ocean, one moment, one voice, one hope, one song. One surge upon the shore of a dream, guiding itself back home, to the only truth it knows. The magical matrix that is Lavos, together with the player and all of Earth's memories transformed accordingly. I think that, in the end, was Earth's truest and most radical dream, culminating in the formation of the only truly unstealable jewel, which was not the frozen flame belonging to nothing, but the Chrono, which belongs to everything. a treasure made up of 2 tears, 2 worlds, and 2 paradoxical children rescued from the brink of death. Schala carried us and all the earth within her heart, only long enough to determine that, although many things in this universe may cause us to act, a love that has known the darkness is the most powerful, and may be the only thing that can't be tainted by evil when everything else disappears.
I haven't talked much about Kid in this video, although her presence and absence alike are felt acutely throughout the storyline.
The name of the orphan found by Luca, Kid, is poignant, her identity a question, an echo, and a stand-in for something deeper. Through Kid, Serge is pulled from the water, just as Schala is pulled from the mires of collective destiny. Through Serge, Kid is rescued from a burning orphanage, just as Serge is nearly consumed by the fires of personal destiny. Schala's mission, like Project Kid, was always about saving the child. But who is the child, really? And what does she stand for? Whoever she is, she's nothing like Schala. Kid is violent, she's broken, and like everybody else, is in hot pursuit of the frozen flame, even willing to kill to get it. She may be Schala's clone, but she's neither particularly refined, nor patient, nor magnanimous, but arrogant, hot-headed, and spiteful. Schala was a princess and luminary. Kid is a thief and loner. And yet, it's almost impossible not to like Kid, because at her core she's everything most people fail to be. She's honest, she's courageous and utterly authentic, she's loyal and dependable, and she's just so unapologetically herself. Even when she's wrong, there's a sense of innocence in it. Kid brags about her grand plans, yet she also lives entirely in the moment. She's adaptable, friendly, and warm, and above all, she seems free. When I think of the way Chrono Cross made me feel when I was 12 or 13, I remember Kid more than anything. Her bright red costume and streaming yellow hair, her acrobatics, her wicked grin after stealing a treasure. Kid was like the living embodiment of the game's nautical, tropical, open-skied freedom. She was like if adventure were a person, and whenever she left the party I missed her. Kid had no idea what she was doing, yet she made the entire quest feel true. Her presence was grounding. She felt like the friend I'd never quite had, and spoke to something very real inside me, and I suspect inside many of us. She's a part of the inner child that refuses to die, something restless inside each of us that clings to hope no matter how bad things get. That small, indomitable spark that stays. When Kid learns the truth of who and what she is, she says, "You're wrong, I'm me, I ain't no Schala's daughter or clone." To which Luca replies, "Yes, that's right, Kid. If that's how you feel, I think Princess Schala would have wanted it to be that way too." And I think this is largely the point of Kid. She's here to remind us that fate can throw whatever it likes at us and still we'll always be ourselves. Even if we're erased, even if we're copied. And the story backs this up. Whenever Kid herself is in serious danger, the universe brings her back. We can't get rid of Kid because we can't get rid of that part of ourselves. But for many, maybe most, that raw, enduring self, the one Kid embodies, also carries deep scars, and very often the part of us that never gives up is the part that was hurt the worst. Kid, in a single moment, lost her home, her family, everything she knew. And the game quietly implies that some part of her remains forever frozen in that moment of grief. And that's why she really resonates, because her story isn't just hers. Somewhere inside each of us is a child still trapped, still enduring something too vast to understand. We feel this intuitively, yet we shrink from it, from the naked truth of our own vulnerability. It's always there, even as everything else moves on, floating in space, half invisible, unsure of where it belongs. It's not grand, not glorious, but quiet and all too ordinary. The part that longs for someone to see our pain in full, every raw, unglamorous detail, every trembling hope, every silent wish in the dark, every night spent crying alone. The part that needs to know it's not alone. Though perhaps Schala would say that none of us are, because we're all that child in the dark. I think Schala wants us to hold that feeling like a child, to bring it into the light by joining it in the darkness. Because it too is part of the song, and once accepted, for all its flaws, it might be the most beautiful part of all. Kid, I believe, represents both the human desire to save those who cannot save themselves, and the part of us that longs to be saved. She is what happens when loss, solitude, and betrayal are finally reunited with hope, love, and forgiveness. She is the human part of Schala, and the only part that could actually reach Serge. And when Schala rescues him, she is rescuing herself and all of life in one act. I realize now that I'm older, in some way, we're all drowning in misery, abandoned in the darkness. But Schala would not leave us to that fate, no matter how much she wanted to die. And maybe she would want to live if she could save that part of herself. So, at the moment Serge is pulled from the brink, the Time Devourer chooses mercy. The universe, at last, chooses to intervene, and humanity decides, the earth decides, in one infinitely connected moment, to see reality for all that it is, and to love it anyway. We are all waves in the ocean of time, rising, inhaling, living, falling, exhaling, dying. But time remembers them all. Schala had a dream that one wave might soar higher than the rest, and maybe, for some of us, that wave is Chrono.
Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll enjoy my future content as well.